So my presentation is really a crash course into PCV2. I'm going to spend about 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes, and go over a little bit of the PCV2 timeline, talk about 2006 when we got our vaccines, but there's a lot of information from before then. Then the caseload over time, how vaccines have helped, some of the diagnostics that we're currently doing and how that's changed over time. And then a couple questions that I oftentimes get is, what about the duration of immunity? What about the mutations of PCV2? Does that have an impact on cross-protection? And I'll share some data that we have. And then last is how we think that you should evaluate vaccines. So 40 years of PCV2. And why do I say 40 years? Well, in 1974, this was the first time that PCV was actually discovered. It was discovered in the PK15 line. And from then, quickly, there were some serologic surveys that were accomplished in Europe, in Asia, in North America. The first PCV pathogenesis study was completed in 1986 and published. And then we started talking about what are the different syndromes, what are the different clinical signs. There's congenital tremors, PDNS, PMWS. There's a discussion, we call it PCVAD here in the States, PCVD over in Europe. And so there's a lot of discussion points, and so we still need to continue to communicate. I think one of the better papers that really puts it all together as far as what do we call each syndrome and each clinical sign associated with PCV is Kim Segalis's in 2012. He really put together a good paper, and I encourage you to go out, look at that, and it really gives you a run-through of the different acronyms that can be used, different clinical signs, and what they mean. Then we started splitting. We tend to do this in the veterinary industry. Start splitting, so it's not just PCV. It's PCV1 and PCV2. And then it was first described as the etiologic agent in PMWS in 1998. And one of my passions is the infection chain of PCV2 and M. hyo. And so how it transmits, not only how it transmits from pig to pig in the nursery or in the finishing stage, but also how it transmits from the sows to the gilts, or the gilts coming into the sow unit, but also from the sows down to the pigs. We can put a lot of vaccine into pigs, but if they're already positive from the sows, what is that impact? And I think today you'll find out some about that, not from myself, but from the other speakers. Then we got the first PCV vaccine in the world. Back in 2004, it was a sow vaccine in Europe. But here in the U.S., we continue to struggle with morbidity and mortality, upwards of 60% morbidity. In some cases that myself out in practice we worked with, we had 15 to 20% mortality in some groups. We continue to struggle. But finally, the AASV task force was set up. It was set up, and it only lasted 2.5 years. 2.5 years. And the main reason that was because PCV2 vaccines were introduced into North America as a piglet vaccine. So we had 3 vaccines from 3 different companies, all introduced at the same time. And as we look at the caseload in a couple slides, we'll see how dramatic those vaccines had an impact on the clinical signs and morbidity, mortality of the pigs. All of those vaccines are based off of PCV2A today. So that was the predominant strain that was available back when the vaccines were first being produced. But during the time of production and the time of launch of all these products, we had a global shift of really PCV2A to PCV2B. Now we still have a lot of PCV2A, and Dr. Murtaugh will allude to some of that or show you that information. But really, was it cross-protection? Were the PCV2As doing a good job? We'll show you some of that information. And then, how do we vaccinate our pigs today? In the U.S., we're going to more and more of a bivalent vaccine, circovirus and mycoplasma vaccines being introduced, and also trivalent vaccine, the trivalent vaccine including those 2 antigens, but then also adding Engelvac PERS MLV. So how do those vaccines work? Again, I said in 2006 is when they were launched here in North America. And if we look at Iowa State, up to 2006, you can see the dramatic increase in the caseload up to 2006 is PCV2 Diagnostics. Now this graph takes 3 years ahead of time, 2003, and continues all the way to 2010. So you can really see the dramatic decrease in percentages of cases that are diagnosed as PCV2B, or excuse me, PCV-AD. Dramatic decrease all the way to 2010, and then Dr. Madsen, he helped me with putting this together just most recently. So what about the last 4 or 5 years? And so last 4 or 5 years, you can see that below 5%, closer to 2 to 4% percentage of the cases that are submitted to Iowa State are PCV2 diagnosed. So the routine diagnostics we do today, this is from the BI standpoint, and the number of tests we run, the number of samples we are running. Probably our most, the samples that we run the most today are placental umbilical cord serum, or PUC samples. You'll hear more about that. Dr. Baumart will talk quite a bit about that. We still run tissues, so in cases where we see PCV-AD out in the farms, clinical signs, we'll euthanize pigs, collect tissues. Serum, oral fluids, and environmental swabs. Environmental swabs, we found that PCV2 is everywhere. When you have a sensitive enough test, you'll likely find it in every farm. And then the tests we're running are PCRs. We have much more sensitive PCRs. We'll talk to that. On the tissues, histopathology, and IHC. For the updated PCV2 qPCR, many of you may be aware of this, but in 2012, the Health Management Center in Ames made their quantitative PCV2 test much more sensitive. Prior to 2012, the cutoff range was 4 logs, 10,000 virus particles per milliliter. 2012, working with the reagents they had in the test, they were able to get that sensitivity down to 2 logs, 100 virus particles per milliliter. So from 10,000 to 100 was now the new cutoff. Today, as they continue to improve, we're measuring 1 log. How sensitive is too sensitive? Still have to answer that question. Well, what this chart shows you, the circle graph, shows you in 4 studies, had we used 4 logs as the cutoff, we would have missed 74% of all the samples that we would have set in. So I know sensitivity, how sensitive is too much. I would suggest that missing 74% of the samples is not acceptable. So knowing which lab you use, knowing what the test is, knowing the reagents and their cutoffs are very important when you're making decisions, when you're evaluating abstracts, papers, etc. This study was done in 2011. This customer had a question. They said, you know, every time that you do a study, BI, and really every time any of the vaccine companies do a study, you always end the study at first cut. So when the last time that all of the pigs are still in the barn. Well, that's usually anywhere between 15, 25% of the pigs are taken, and then you have the remainder of the pigs still in the barn. How do they continue growing? So we set up the study with the customer to take a look at their first cut, which they took out 20% of the pigs. The second cut, which they took out another 20% of the pigs. And then at that final cut, there are still 60% of the pigs in the barn that need to be measured. And so we measured continuously right before each cut. And we wanted to look at the average daily gain, which is oftentimes one of our primary parameters in our studies. So the question was, does your vaccine hold all the way to finishing for 100% of my pigs? And the answer to here that we came up with, working with the customer, is that yes, a single dose worked all the way through, had protection. Worked at least as well in this situation, worked statistically better when measured by average daily gain than a 2-dose parameter. These pigs were naturally infected. It was a triplicate study, so run in 3 different barns. There was PERS exposure, there was SIV exposure, there was mycoplasma exposure, and confirmed of circovirus exposure. Now, when were these pigs exposed? This is just an example, one of the replicates showing pig exposure, measuring PCV2 viremia. 100% of the pigs at first cut were viremic in this situation. These were in the non-vaccinate pigs that were in the barn. So these were not the vaccinates from either the 1-dose or the 2-dose, but these were the non-vaccinates. So PCV2 was still circulating at 140 days, and both vaccine protocols protected all the way through market. Another question I've gotten a lot since 2012, what about the mutations of PCV2? Hear a lot about that now. There's been a couple papers put out about it from Dr. Opresnik's lab talking about this novel mutation. And yes, PCV2 does mutate. It's like any virus, it will continue to mutate. It's a DNA virus, so it doesn't mutate as much as a RNA virus like PERS or IAV. But these are just two examples of dendrograms, one from 2009, one from 2013, just showing the wide variety, the differences. Dr. Murtaugh will talk about how small these differences are in these DNA and how there are a couple different ones that kind of jump out and we know or don't know about those. But when we look at cross-protection, probably you're most familiar with the cross-protection papers that BI has done with Engelvac, PERS, MLV, and ATP, and showing every time that there's a new pathogenic strain out there, we take the vaccine, we put it in the clinical trials, and compare to make sure that we have cross-protection. The same is true about Circoflex. In our trial, in our first study, our licensing data, we had a heterologous challenge with a PCV2A vaccine. And then we, in this Takahagi paper, 16 strains cross-protection, I'll show in a little bit. Robert de Rossier's paper in 2009 describes different ages of vaccination, but there are also a couple different PCV2Bs that were present. Again, the vaccine's PCV2A, but cross-protection was seen with PCV2Bs. Greg Klein's vet record paper, and then two papers that will actually be available here at AASV. And so I'll touch on those, a little tease to go out and listen to those presentations, look at the poster. So Takahagi's paper, big dendrogram here. He looked at a lot of different sites. The sites in black, those are 16 different sites that were identified, and it was a before and after type of study with no vaccine and then Circoflex involved. And so it compared, okay, what was the benefit? It looked at clinical signs, looked at mortality, viremia, and in all cases, clinical signs decreased with Circoflex in all of those, whether it was PCV2A1, PCV2A2, or PCVAB. Now, the mortality was only statistically significant in the 2As and the 2Bs. As you notice, the 2As were much lower in these situations, more at a baseline level anyways, and there's evidence in the literature that says PCV2A1s are less pathogenic than the others. That's probably one reason. But then viremia was reduced in all cases as well. So just adding to the body of evidence that there's cross-protection of PCV2A vaccines against PCV2As and Bs. Greg Haywick's paper, along with Mark Eichmeyer, who will present, is looking at Circoflex, a PCV2A vaccine, and comparing it against a new strain taken from the field recently in the U.S., a novel strain, and testing for cross-protection. I won't give too much away, but it will be an oral presentation in the industrial session. And Dirk Werling's paper, who's with us today, you can ask him even more. It was a study that was designed to evaluate cell-mediated immunity, which we know is important for PCV2 protection. He looked at humoral immunity, and he looked at cell-mediated immunity, and was able to show that Circoflex was able to amount to both responses. So again, I encourage you to go to the poster session, talk to Dirk, ask him questions. So what about this novel mutation? And the novel mutation, just so we're all on the same page, many of you here in the U.S. might have heard of MPCV2B. It is just another mutation. I call it a novel mutation because it was just described in 2012. There's been 3 papers out on it. One was presented last year, or 2 years ago at AASV. Excuse me, that would actually have been 2013 AASV. And then also on the ISU diagnostic reports, if the viruses that they sequence come back similar to this particular mutation that Tanya Opresnik's lab, they are reporting it in the notes, in the comments, as MPCV2B. There's been some discussion, is that the proper way, or should we be reporting this based on percent homology or heterology to other known viruses? So, for example, if a farm B were to come out and find that they had a certain strain, could they go and sequence it, and what's the percent homology to this particular strain, or the vaccine strains, or some other isolates. So what's really the big difference between this MPCV2B? I'll spend a little bit of time. Dr. Murtaugh will spend a little bit as well. It's really a single amino acid difference. So from 233, there's an additional amino acid for 234. And you can see up at the upper right-hand corner, MPCV2 versus PCV2B for this side, MPCV2, PCV2B. It does separate a little bit, but again, Dr. Murtaugh will talk what that difference is. So measurements, how should we be measuring how vaccines work, and comparatively? The clinical picture, diagnostics. Prior to commercial vaccines being available, viremia was present, and it was suggested that anywhere between 10 to the 6th and 10 to the 7th logs would have been used to diagnose PMWS. There are several papers that stated that. And clinical pigs for PMWS, PCV-AD, always had higher viremia. But then the vaccines entered the market. Viremia is still present. It's at a much lower level. There's been studies on what is the presence of viremia in pigs compared to the average daily gain seen in those pigs. 1 dose and 2 dose don't seem to have a difference in the magnitude that they drop viremia, although both do drop viremia. Probably pretty familiar with these papers. I encourage you to go look at these. But really, if you look at the bottom left, this slide here is vaccinated pigs. Vaccinated pigs. The straight line is indicating that in those pigs, although they were vaccinated, the levels of viremia that they had no impact on their average daily gain. So as long as you vaccinate pigs, the level of viremia for PCV2 does not have an impact on average daily gain. This is just examples showing the relative decrease of vaccinated pigs in various protocols, 1 dose versus 1 dose, or 1 doses versus 2 dose. This is very consistently seen. Percentage of pigs will decrease over time, the amount of viremia compared to non-vaccinates in the same group. As long as they're vaccinated, viremia is decreased, never eliminated. My last couple slides here. Looking at trial results, this is a 1-dose protocol versus a 1-dose protocol. Are there differences in 1-dose protocols? These 3 trials were run. They were run separately, separate customers, set up slightly different. But if all of these were in the same situation, they're all on-dose usages of these products. If they're set up and combined in these 3 buildings, there is a total of 2,000 pigs, roughly equal numbers of pigs. And you look at the combined numbers, this is what you would come up with. So if you were the production individual, you could make your decision based on this. I'm not showing any statistics here. So out of the 1,000 pigs, you can roughly see that there wasn't much change in the number of pigs. There wasn't actually a statistical difference in the average weight gain between these pigs, although there is a 1.6 pound difference in the total number of between the 2 treatments. So if we go use that information, put it into an example financial scenario, and start with 1,000 pigs at 16 pounds, grow them out for 140 days using the same average daily gains we saw in the previous one, using a carcass yield of 74%. The total difference in actual carcass that would have come out of these barns would have been almost a ton, 1,800 pounds. In a 2,400 head building, that would have been a 2-ton difference in those pigs that were utilized, that were vaccinated. So utilizing data that was, again, I have to say that it was not statistically evaluated, but it would have been a 2-ton difference in there. 1,400 total for these 1,000 pigs with a benefit of $1.41, not taking any consideration of any vaccine cost for the Circoflex over vaccine B. So those are a few things, questions that I get asked routinely. That's the way that I work with customers to evaluate vaccines, talk about our vaccines. And I think you're going to really enjoy the next few speakers as we talk about some immunology and the infection chain of PCV2. Appreciate it. Thank you.